Consciousness is the most intimate thing we know, and yet the hardest to define. It is the light by which everything else is seen, but when we turn that light upon itself, it slips away. Every culture, every science, and every contemplative tradition has tried to grasp it, only to discover that what we call mind is less a possession than a field, an unfolding process rather than an object that can be held. In early Buddhism, consciousness, vijñāna, was not treated as a single substance or a permanent soul. It was one link in the chain of dependent arising, a process that arises in dependence on conditions. When there is I and visible form, there is I consciousness. When there is ear and sound, there is ear consciousness. Each sense world gives rise to its own knowing. Consciousness is not a container, but a contact, a moment of illumination when conditions meet. The Buddha spoke of 6 kinds of consciousness: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. The mind sense, manas, includes thoughts, images, emotions, and memories. Together they form the web of experience. None of them stands alone. Remove the sense base or the object, and the consciousness dependent on it fades. Like fire needing fuel, consciousness depends on contact. It is a relationship, not an entity. This insight was revolutionary. In a world shaped by the Upanishadic search for the eternal self, the Buddha pointed instead to impermanence and contingency. Consciousness is not the witness beyond change, but the flow of change itself. What we call I am aware is not one unbroken beam, but a sequence of flashes, each conditioned by the previous one, like a candle lighting the next. The stream appears continuous, but the flame at each moment is new. In the Abhidharma, Buddhist philosophers analyzed this process with astonishing precision. They described consciousness as a rapid succession of mind moments, citta-khanna, each arising and ceasing faster than a blink. Between these moments, there is no static observer, only continuity of causal influence. The analogy often used is that of a river. The water is always changing, yet the river retains a pattern through motion. This stream of consciousness is dynamic order, not fixed identity. When the Buddha was asked whether consciousness migrates from life to life, he refused both yes and no. Consciousness, he said, arises with conditions. It is not an eternal traveler, but a conditional continuity, supported by intention and craving. The famous simile of one candle lighting another captures this perfectly. The light continues, but no substance passes. Rebirth is the continuity of process, not of a soul. Later Buddhist traditions deepened this analysis. In the Yogācāra school, consciousness becomes the central field of investigation. Vasubandhu and Asanga described 8 layers of awareness, from the 5 sensory kinds to mental consciousness, self-reflective awareness, and a subtle storehouse called alaya vijñāna. This storehouse holds the latent seeds of past actions, bija, which ripen into future experience. It is not a soul. It is a dynamic reservoir of potential. Just as a field holds the memory of seeds but not their permanence, alaya holds karmic tendencies without eternal identity. This model allowed the Yogācāra thinkers to explain continuity without essence, memory without a fixed self. The alaya is neither annihilated at death nor unchanging. It transforms according to cause and condition. When greed, hatred, and delusion are uprooted, the storehouse itself is purified, and consciousness becomes clear, like still water reflecting the moon. In Mahāyāna thought, especially in the Lankavatara Sutra, the Buddha's teaching on consciousness turned into a vision of awakening itself. When the storehouse consciousness is transformed through deep realization, it becomes the wisdom consciousness, adarsha vijñāna, mirror-like awareness. The same mind that once distorted reality through ignorance becomes the mind that reflects things as they are. This transformation, called ashraya paravritti, the turning at the deepest base, is not the creation of a new entity, but the recognition that mind was never separate from reality. The Zen masters later expressed this in a single phrase: "This very mind is Buddha." They did not mean that our ordinary wandering thoughts are enlightened, but that consciousness itself, when unobstructed, is not other than awakening. Clouds pass, but the sky was never lost. Meanwhile, in modern philosophy and science, the study of consciousness has taken its own winding path. From Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," to the neural correlates of consciousness in contemporary neuroscience, the question remains open. How does subjective experience arise from physical processes? No one yet knows. But the discoveries of recent decades have drawn closer to the Buddhist insight that mind is a process of relation, not an object. Neuroscience now describes consciousness as emergent from patterns of neural activity distributed across vast networks. The global workspace theory proposes that when information becomes globally available across the brain, it enters awareness. The integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, suggests that consciousness corresponds to the degree of integrated complexity within a system. In both views, awareness is not a light bulb that switches on once and stays steady. It is a field of dynamic coherence that arises when many parts interact. The parallel with dependent arising is striking. No single neuron is conscious, but together they give rise to awareness, just as no single condition makes experience exist alone. Experiments with brain imaging also reveal that what we call self-awareness is an activity, not a location. When people meditate deeply or enter flow states, regions such as the medial prefrontal cortex, the so-called default mode network, quiet down. As this network relaxes, the boundaries of self fade. Subject and object merge into a unified field of experience. Practitioners report calm clarity, scientists record reduced self-referential processing, and the ancient texts would call it the cooling of grasping. The languages differ, but the observation is shared. Quantum physics has added another echo to this understanding. In the quantum field, particles do not have fixed properties until interaction occurs. Observation is not a detached act, but part of the event. Some physicists, like John Wheeler, even suggested that the universe is participatory, that reality unfolds through observation. While this does not mean consciousness creates reality, it does remind us that knowing and being are entangled. The Buddhist view that consciousness arises in dependence on its objects fits elegantly into this relational picture. Mind and world are co-arising, not two separate things. Yet Buddhism goes beyond description. It asks what consciousness is for and how it can be freed from distortion. The problem is not that we have consciousness, but that we misunderstand it. We treat the stream as a possession. We say, my mind, my thoughts, my awareness. But when the Buddha invited his disciples to examine consciousness, he asked them to notice how awareness itself arises and passes, colored by craving, aversion, and delusion. Awareness knows, but it also gets entangled in what it knows. Liberation begins when knowing is no longer possessed by the knower. The Satipatthana Sutta gives the earliest systematic map of how this observation works. Mindfulness of body, feeling, mind, and phenomena allows awareness to see its own texture. When the mind is greedy, one knows there is greed. When the mind is not greedy, one knows there is no greed. Awareness becomes meta-awareness, reflective without attachment. This reflexivity, knowing that one knows, is what later philosophers called self-luminous consciousness, svasa evedana. It is not a second self looking at the first. It is the intrinsic clarity of experience illuminating itself. Indian philosophers debated this for centuries. The Yogācāra school affirmed reflexive awareness, while the Madhyamaka, following Nagarjuna, warned that any claim of inherent existence, even for awareness, risks reifying emptiness. Their dialogue refined the Buddhist understanding. Awareness functions, but it is empty. It illuminates, but it is not an entity. To experience this directly is to step beyond the subject-object split. Modern cognitive science calls this metacognition. Studies show that when people develop the ability to notice thoughts as thoughts rather than as commands, emotional reactivity decreases. The brain's amygdala calms, and prefrontal regulation improves. What the laboratory measures as neural modulation, the meditator feels as spaciousness. Awareness becomes the space in which events arise, not the judge who suffers them. From the standpoint of ethics, this matters profoundly. When awareness is contracted around self-interest, it fuels greed and fear. When awareness opens and sees interdependence, compassion arises naturally. The Pali Canon calls this the expansion of the heart, chitta viveka, the withdrawal of mind from narrow clinging. Consciousness, freed from craving, becomes luminous. The Buddha said, "This mind is radiant, but it is defiled by visiting impurities. Practice does not create purity. It reveals it." In later Mahāyāna texts, consciousness was identified with the Dharmadhatu, the field of reality itself. The Avatāsaka Sutra describes a universe where every particle reflects all others, like jewels in Indra's net. Each consciousness contains the reflection of all consciousnesses. This is not poetry. It is metaphysics of interpenetration. Awareness is not a local property trapped in a skull. It is the openness through which reality experiences itself. Contemporary science, cautiously, begins to echo this through the study of panpsychism and consciousness fields. Thinkers like Philip Goff and neuroscientist Christoph Koch have proposed that consciousness may be a fundamental feature of reality, not an accidental byproduct of matter. Integrated information theory, again, leans in this direction, suggesting that wherever there is causal integration, there is a spark of awareness. The Buddha would not have agreed or disagreed in metaphysical terms, but he might have smiled. For him, the crucial task was not to prove that consciousness pervades the universe, but to understand how consciousness, here and now, becomes free from delusion. Freedom in this context means the end of reactive identification. When a thought arises and is known as a thought, it loses its power to enslave. When a feeling arises and is known as a feeling, it becomes part of awareness rather than its master. This clarity grows through practice. Concentration gathers the scattered beams of attention. Insight turns that beam onto impermanence, seeing the arising and passing of every experience. Gradually, the sense of a watcher behind the stream dissolves. Awareness remains luminous, compassionate, unentangled. Modern psychology calls this state self-transcendence. Studies of advanced meditators, as well as of those in awe-inspiring natural experiences, show decreased activation in brain networks of self-focus and increased connectivity in those related to empathy and perception. The subjective report matches the Buddhist description. There is vivid presence, but no center. Experience flows, but the claim of ownership has vanished. This is not a trance or a void. It is the natural functioning of consciousness without clinging. In the Visuddhimagga, Buddhaghosa used the image of a lamp illuminating itself and others. Consciousness, he said, knows itself through knowing objects. There is no need for a second observer. The knowing is self-revealing. When mindfulness stabilizes, this luminosity becomes evident. It is not mystical in the sense of supernatural. It is mystical because it is immediate and cannot be captured by concept. The eye cannot see itself, yet vision happens. This understanding transforms how one lives. When consciousness is seen as process, not possession, humility deepens. Praise and blame, gain and loss, joy and sorrow still come, but they move through awareness like weather through the sky. The sky does not resist the storm. It does not hold the clouds. It allows and clears. To live from such mind is not to escape life, but to meet it fully without contraction. Ethically, this view grounds responsibility in causality rather than in ego. Actions matter not because a soul carries them, but because cause and effect shape experience continuously. To harm another is to sow suffering in the field of shared mind. To act with compassion is to heal that field. Awareness and ethics are not separate. Both are patterns of relationship. In the Dhammapada it says, "Mind precedes all things. Mind is their chief." Understanding consciousness is therefore understanding the architecture of reality itself. Today, as neuroscience probes deeper into the brain, and artificial intelligence simulates fragments of cognition, the Buddhist insight remains startlingly relevant. Machines can process information, but whether they can experience whether there is something it is like to be a machine brings us back to the mystery the Buddha refused to turn into dogma. Consciousness is not merely data processing. It is the presence that makes a world appear. It cannot be produced like a product. It can only arise when conditions of awareness meet. Perhaps the most precise summary is found in the Buddha's own silence. When asked whether the Tathagata exists after death, he did not answer. Any answer would have implied a fixed identity. The enlightened consciousness, he said elsewhere, is deep, boundless, like the ocean. It is not annihilation. It is release from the conceit, I am. What remains is knowing without knower, compassion without owner, presence without boundary. If we ask again, what is consciousness in Buddhism? We can say this much. It is the knowing quality of existence, arising with conditions, vanishing with them, never captured by the words that describe it. It is the lamp that burns without self, the mirror that reflects without residue, the field in which all things appear and disappear. Science may measure its correlates, philosophy may analyze its logic, but only direct seeing reveals its freedom. To live with this understanding is to let awareness serve wisdom rather than ego. It is to meet each moment freshly without the burden of me. It is to know the world as interwoven with mind and mind as transparent to the world. In that seeing, the boundaries of self thin, compassion expands, and life moves in harmony with reality. The question then shifts from what is consciousness to how will this consciousness be used? And that, the Buddha might say, is where awakening begins.